Living Forever, A Tale Across Centuries. Chapter 1, Awakening. He woke with a start, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. His first instinct was to reach for his phone to check the time, but his hand met only rough, straw-stuffed bedding. His eyes flew open and he sat up abruptly, confusion giving way to alarm. The room was small, dimly lit by the faint light filtering through the single narrow window. The walls were rough-hewn timber, the floor packed with dirt. This was not his bedroom. This was not his world. He stumbled to his feet, heart pounding. He was dressed in a coarse linen, unfamiliar and uncomfortable against his skin. His head swam with 1,000 questions, but there were no answers to be found in this primitive space. The panic rose, but he forced it down, focusing instead on his surroundings. He had to understand when he was. He pushed open the wooden door and stepped outside, blinking against the sudden brightness. The sight that met his eyes was like a scene from a history book. A cluster of small, thatched-roofed cottages, smoke rising from their chimneys, chickens pecking at the dirt, and people, peasants by the look of them, going about their daily lives. He was in a village, and from the looks of it, a medieval one. His mind raced. The last thing he remembered was going to bed in his apartment in the year 2024. There was no logical explanation for how he could be here, in what appeared to be the Middle Ages. Yet here he was. The people around him paid him little mind, too absorbed in their own tasks to notice his bewilderment. He walked through the village in a daze, trying to piece together what had happened. The language he heard was English, though it was older, rougher, laced with words and phrases long since fallen out of use. The realization hit him hard. He had, somehow, been transported back in time. But why? And how? His first challenge was survival. He had no money, no place to stay, and no idea how to navigate this world. His modern knowledge, once a strength, now felt like a burden. What good was it to know about computers, electricity, and the internet when surrounded by people who had never seen a book, let alone a smartphone? He found himself at the edge of the village, near a stream. He knelt by the water, splashing his face to clear his thoughts. As he looked at his reflection, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if the man staring back at him was someone else entirely. He was in his mid-30s, average in every way, average height, average build, average looks. There was nothing special about him, nothing that marked him as someone who could survive in a world like this. But he really had no choice. He had to adapt, to learn, or he would die here, in this alien past. The first step was to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to himself. He would need food, shelter, and a way to make a living. But more than that, he would need to understand this world, its rules and its dangers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, he made a vow to himself. He would survive. He would find a way to make a life in this strange ancient time. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way back to his own. Chapter 2. Learning the Ropes. The days blurred into weeks, and the man who had once lived in a world of concrete and glass began to find his place among the wood and stone of the medieval village. He quickly learned that the key to survival was to keep his head low and observe. He watched how the villagers interacted, how they worked, and how they lived. Slowly, he began to understand their ways. His first challenge had been finding food. With no money and no skills that were immediately useful in this world, he had been forced to rely on the kindness of strangers. He offered to help with simple tasks, chopping wood, carrying water, in exchange for a meal or a place to sleep. It was hard, grueling work, but it kept him alive. As he integrated himself into the village, he began to think about how he could use his knowledge to his advantage. He knew things that could change the lives of these people, things that could make him valuable. But he also knew that knowledge could be dangerous. He had to be careful to introduce his ideas slowly, lest he be branded a witch or a heretic. He started small. He had basic understanding of medicine, having taken a first aid course years ago. It wasn't much, but in a time where even a simple cut could be fatal, it was enough. He began treating minor injuries, using his knowledge of cleanliness and simple remedies to help the villagers. Word of his skills spread, and soon people were coming to him with all manner of ailments. The village had no real healer, only a wise woman who used herbs and chants to treat the sick. She eyed him with suspicion at first, but when she saw that his methods worked, she grudgingly accepted him. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance, combing his modern knowledge with her traditional wisdom. As his reputation grew, so did his wealth. People paid him in food, clothing, and sometimes even money. He used what he earned to improve his situation, buying better clothes, better tools, and eventually a small cottage on the edge of the village. It was a modest life, but it was a start. He was careful though not to push too far, too fast. He knew that his knowledge of the future could be as much a curse as a blessing. The village was a small, insular place, and anything too strange or too new could be met with fear and violence. So he worked quietly, improving his skills and building relationships, always mindful of the need to stay under the radar. But even as he settled into this new life, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, of living in a world that wasn't his own. He missed the comforts of the modern world, the ease of life in a time where everything was at your fingertips. Here, everything was a struggle, a battle against the elements, against ignorance, against time itself. Yet, there was something liberating about it as well. Here, he was free from the pressures of the modern world, from the constant barrage of information and technology. Here, he could start over, build something from nothing, using only his wits and his will. As the days turned into months, he began to see the possibilities, the ways in which he could shape this world to his advantage. He would have to be patient though, to play the long game. But for the first time since he had awoken in this strange ancient place, he felt a flicker of hope. He could do this, he could survive, and maybe, just maybe, he could thrive. Chapter 3. Building a Foundation. Years passed, and the man from the future became a fixture in the village. He was no longer the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. He was a respected member of the community, known for his skills and his wisdom. But he had not forgotten his origins, nor the knowledge that had brought him so far. He had learned to think in terms of decades, not years. His initial struggles for survival had given way to a more calculated approach to life. He began to invest in land, buying small plots from farmers who were struggling to make ends meet. He knew that land was the one resource that would always hold value, no matter the time or place. With each piece of land he acquired, he grew more powerful. He hired workers to tend the fields, and soon he had a small but profitable farm. He used his knowledge of crop rotation and simple irrigation techniques to improve the yields, and the success of his farm only increased his standing in the village. But he didn't stop there. He began to think about the future, about the world beyond the village. He knew that the world would change, that kingdoms would rise and fall, and he wanted to be ready for whatever came next. He started to make contacts in the nearby town, trading his surplus crops for goods and information. He learned about the politics of the region, about the shifting alliances and the constant threat of war. He was careful though to keep his true intentions hidden. To the villagers, he was simply a farmer who had found success through hard work and a bit of luck. But in his mind, he was laying the groundwork for something much bigger. He began to accumulate wealth, not just in the form of land and crops, but in gold and silver, in precious stones and artifacts that he stored away, hidden in places where no one would think to look. His wealth gave him power, and with power came influence. He was able to negotiate better deals, to secure favors from those in positions of authority. He knew that in this world, as in his own, money could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. But with his growing influence came new challenges. People began to notice his success, to whisper about the man who seemed to know too much, who had always seemed one step ahead. He knew that he had to be careful, to avoid drawing too much attention to himself. He had seen what happened to those who were perceived as threats, and he had no desire to end up on the wrong side of a noose. So he played the role of the humble farmer, the man who had simply been blessed by good fortune. He made sure to give generously to the church, to help those in need, to be seen as a benefactor rather than a threat. But behind the scenes, he continued to build his empire, always thinking ahead, always planning for the future. As the years turned into decades, he began to notice something strange. While the people around him aged and grew old, he remained the same. His hair did not gray, his skin did not wrinkle, his strength did not fade. It was as if time had stopped for him, while the world continued to move forward. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a byproduct of the slow pace of life in the village. But as the years passed and the changes became more pronounced, he could no longer deny the truth. He was not aging. He was immortal. Chapter 4: Realization of Immortality. The realization came slowly, creeping into his mind like a cold fog. Decades had passed since he had first awoken in this strange world, and while the people around him had changed, he had not. The children he had once played with were now old men and women, their faces lined with the passage of time. But he remained unchanged, as if frozen in the moment he had first opened his eyes in the medieval village. The discovery had both exhilarating and terrifying effects. Immortality was something that many had dreamed of, but the reality was far more complex. He was free from the fear of death, but he was also condemned to watch everyone he knew and loved grow old and die, while he remained the same. The thought of outliving everyone he cared about filled him with a deep, unshakable loneliness. He kept his secret to himself, knowing that if someone discovered the truth, it could mean the end of everything he had built. Immortality was a gift, but it was also a curse, one that could easily lead to suspicion, fear, and violence. He had to be careful to ensure that no one noticed the passage of time had no effect on him. As the years turned into centuries, he began to adapt to his new reality. He learned to live simple lives, moving from one place to another when people began to notice that he was not aging. He would stay in one village or town for a few decades, building a life for himself, then disappear, leaving behind a legacy of wealth and success. He became a master of reinvention, adopting new identities and professions with each move. Sometimes he was a merchant, sometimes a scholar, sometimes a landowner. Each life was carefully constructed with a history that could withstand scrutiny. He learned to forge documents, to create false backgrounds, to build a web of lies that would protect his secrets. But no matter how many lives he lived, the loneliness remained. He had loved and lost more times than he could count, and each loss cut deeper than the last. He tried to avoid getting too close to people, knowing that they would age and die while he remained the same. But it was impossible to live without forming connections, without caring for people around him. He began to focus on the long term, on the legacy he would leave behind. He accumulated wealth and knowledge, hoarding both of them like a dragon guarding its treasure. He built networks of influence, ensuring that he would always have allies in high places. He knew that the world would continue to change, and he wanted to be ready for whatever the future held. As the centuries passed, he watched the world evolve. He saw the rise and fall of empires, the birth of new nations, the explosion of knowledge and technology. He marveled at the inventions that came into being, things he had once taken for granted in his old life. The printing press, the steam engine, electricity, the telephone, each new development was a reminder of the world he had left behind, and a glimpse of the future he was now a part of. But with each new era came new dangers. The world was becoming more interconnected, and it was becoming harder to keep his secret. He had to be more careful, more discreet, as the possibility of exposure grew with each passing year. He could no longer afford to live openly, to be known and recognized. He had to become a shadow, a ghost, moving through the world unseen and unheard. Chapter 5: The Long Game. By the time the world entered the modern era, he had perfected the art of living in the shadows. He was a master of disguise, a man with 1,000 faces and 1,000 names. He moved from place to place, country to country, always staying one step ahead of discovery. His wealth had grown to unimaginable levels, hidden in banks and vaults around the world, invested in companies and properties that spanned the globe. He had lived through wars and revolutions, seen the rise of democracy and the fall of monarchies. He had witnessed the horrors of the world wars, the Cold War, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Through it all, he had remained a silent observer, never interfering, always watching. His immortality had given him a unique perspective on the world. He had seen the patterns of history, the cycles of rise and fall, of progress and regression. He knew that nothing was permanent, that everything changed in time. He had learned to think in centuries, to plan for the long term, to play the long game. He no longer tried to accumulate wealth for its own sake. He had more money that he could ever spend, more power that he could ever use. Instead, he focused on ensuring his continued survival. He invested in technologies that could help him stay hidden, in companies that could provide him with the tools he needed to remain undetected. He created layers of identities, each one more elaborate and secure than the last. But despite all his precautions, he knew that the world was becoming a more dangerous place for someone like him. The advent of the internet, of global communication and surveillance, made it harder to disappear, to erase his tracks. He had to be more careful than ever to ensure that no one could connect the dots, that no one could discover the truth about him. He lived a life of constant vigilance, always on guard, always ready to disappear at a moment's notice. He had learned to trust no one, to rely only on himself. He had become a ghost, a myth, a legend that no one believed in, but everyone whispered about. But even as he lived in the shadows, he continued to plan for the future. He knew that the world would continue to change, that new technologies would emerge, that new challenges would arise. And he was determined to survive, no matter what. Chapter 6. Present Day. In the present day, he was a shadow, a figure who moved unseen through the world. He had amassed a fortune that rivaled that of entire nations, controlled companies and industries that spanned the globe, yet no one knew his name. He was a myth, a ghost story whispered about in dark corners but never seen, never caught. He lived in a secluded estate, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. The estate was a fortress, equipped with the latest technology to ensure his privacy and security. It was a place where he could retreat from the world, where he could be alone with his thoughts. He no longer had to worry about the day-to-day struggles of survival. He had people to handle that for him, loyal servants who knew only what he wanted them to know. He had become a master of delegation, of pulling the strings from behind the scenes, of manipulating events to suit his needs. But despite all his wealth, all his power, he was still alone. The loneliness that had plagued him for centuries was still there, a constant companion that he could never escape. He had lived through so much, seen so much, yet he still felt empty inside. He had learned to accept it, to live with it. It was the price of immortality, a price he had paid many times over. He knew that he could never be able to change it, that he would always be alone, a man out of time, forever watching the world move on without him. As he looked over the world he had helped shape, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The world was changing faster than ever, new technologies and new ideas emerging at a pace that even he found difficult to keep up with. But he was ready for it, as he always was. He had learned to adapt, to change with the time, to survive. But as he passed by a mirror, a flicker of silver caught his eye, and he paused, noticing for the first time that he had a few extra grey hairs. If you've enjoyed this story and would like to hear some more, do let us know in the comments below. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us a lot. Thanks.